Hello again out in the VC, everybody. It's Matt, and I did a earlier review today on Living in the Material World by George Harrison. So I'm doing his albums in order of release. Thought I would do another one, and so we move ahead to his next release, which is Dark Horse. Came out December 9th, 1974. The album got to number 4 in America. Oddly enough, probably kind of unbelievably, in my opinion, it didn't chart at all in England, which is just strange. You would have thought it would have, given the success of All Things Must Pass and Material World before it, that it would have at least gone top 20, if not top 10. But it didn't even make the top 50 over there, so don't know what was up with that. But around the rest of the world, it's generally hit in the top 10 or so, and top four, number 4, like I said, in America. Strange album, an odd album, album that is a lot of times cited as George Harrison's worst solo album, and critically reviled for the most part. The fans didn't like it for the most part, though it does have its defenders and it does have its fans. But kind of a almost doomed from the start album, and it's one that back in the 70s as a kid, I bought all of the Beatles solo albums that were out up to that point, with the exception of 4 or 5 that I didn't end up getting years later, into the 80s or 90s, for various reasons. And this was one that I never got a copy of until sometime in the 80s. I had heard some of the songs off of here, not everything, but I'd heard quite a few of the songs back in the 70s. But several reasons for that. I was 10, 12, 14-year-old kid in the 70s, so it's not like I had a lot of money. I could only get albums as I could afford them, or Christmas presents and so forth, or begging my parents for money like you do when you're a kid. So this was on my list to get with the other 3 or 4 solo Beatle albums that I didn't have in the by and by. But everything I read about this album back then was that this is just, you know, junk, and it's his worst and avoid at all costs. So even though being Beatle product, I wanted it, I wasn't in a huge hurry to get to it, and so I just never got around to it for years and years later. Had a copy that I got rid of, so I had to go out and get another copy here, and I picked this up about a month ago or so. But and I hadn't heard it in years, with the exception of Dark Horse and Ding Dong, a couple of songs that everyone knows. So I came to it almost new, really. Uh, so yeah, given the reputation of this album as being no good, I was not expecting much, and I found myself surprised that I heartily enjoyed this album. I think it's a pretty darn good album, even though it's not really a good album. It's a pretty poor album. Despite that, I really liked it, really enjoyed it. So this is going to be a funny review because I'm going to review it, but I don't know that I could really recommend this to anyone unless you're just a hardcore Beatle fan that has to have everything they ever did. Certainly, if you're a casual fan or if you're new to George's solo music, go out and get All Things Must Pass or Material World or Brainwashed or something first, or 33 and a Third. Don't start with this. This may be one that you really never even need to bother with. But I guess for me, it's one of those classic kind of, I don't want to say bad, but not good albums. I'm a Gunner by Pink Floyd comes to mind that I just have a soft spot for. Not something I'd want to listen to all the time, but it's one of those that when the mood hits, nothing else will do type albums. But I think, while I'm not going to, praise this to the skies by any means, I think it's a better album than its reputation would have a lot of people believe. So, it's an ill-fated album from the beginning in a lot of ways. His marriage to Patty was over pretty much by this point. Some of that had started probably even earlier than Living in the Material World, but here it kind of came to a head, and she ran off with Eric Clapton and all. You all know the story of all that stuff. But of course, he was, disappointed to lose his wife and all. But at the same time, he meets Olivia during this period, and I don't know if they fell in love immediately. They eventually get married, but at this point, they just sort of meeting each other. George is also going through continual uh, tribulations with the Beatles breakup and the court cases and all that going on. He's trying to start a new record label, Dark Horse, so he's got all that going on. He's trying to put an album together. He also, around this time, kind of falls off the wagon back into drinking, drugs, and uh, sort of crisis of faith that he had, with his meditation and all his religious stuff that he had been uh, somewhat at least faithful to for the past few years. So there's all sorts of just upheaval and drama going on here and during the making of this album. And on top of this, he decides, for whatever reason, I'm not sure, that this is a good time to go out on tour. The Beatle who is the one who liked touring the least becomes the Beatle who's the first one to do a tour after the breakup. Kind of strange. But, and also his voice, this is sometimes called Dark Horse, Horse, because he's got laryngitis and a very hoarse voice. Not the best time for him to make an album, and certainly not the best time for him to go out on tour. On top of that, I don't know if he needed money because the Beatle money was all tied up in litigation, and or he just thought it was a good time to go out on tour. Maybe the fact that his marriage was breaking up and he was sort of back into the drinking and drugging. Maybe he thought if he got out of the situation, that would help. I don't know, but it was a ill-fated choice to make an album and to go out on tour. But life is armchair quarterback retrospect a lot of times, so maybe it seemed like a good idea at the time. The tour was, everything I've read, a disaster. His voice was shot. The album didn't come out until halfway through the tour, so he's, more than half of the tour dates, he's playing these new songs that haven't been released, and the public's not familiar with them, doesn't know what he's doing. He wouldn't play Beatles songs. He played a few Beatles songs, but he was changing the lyrics to, in my life, I've loved God more instead of I love you more. He insisted on having Ravi Shankar and that bunch come out and play 30, 40 minutes of Indian sitar music before the concert started, which, kids in 1974 didn't want to sit through that. They wanted rock and roll and so forth. And so I don't know. In 1974, I was 11 years old. He played in Fort Worth. I would have loved to have seen the concert, but I was a little kid. I wasn't even aware that he'd played in Fort Worth till 2 or 3 years later. And I'm not sure my parents would have let me go to see a concert when I was 11 anyway, but sure wish I would have had a chance to have seen him in concert. I would love for some of this live stuff to be released, film, or just a live album, to see how bad or not bad it is, because some of the musicians involved said that the shows were actually pretty good. I don't know, but it said that, as George was mixing it up with sort of jazz and funk and soul and rock and roll and world music and the Indian music, and it was just sort of, people were expecting him to still be the mop-top Beatle, the critics and the fans alike, and he wanted to move on to something else, because George was always sort of the least Beatlesque solo Beatle of the bunch. He sometimes he'd tip his hat to the Beatles' past and his own past, but for the most part, once the Beatles were over, George walked away and did his own thing and didn't look back too often the way that Paul and Ringo and even sometimes John did. And that rubbed fans and critics the wrong way a lot of times, I think. So that played a part into it. Anyway, this was also, the critics had also, especially Rolling Stone, which was becoming irrelevant by that time as far as quality, but they had already sort of set up Paul and knocked him down with Wildlife and knocked down John for some time in New York City. And so after having praised George effusively for all things must pass and Bangladesh and all, I guess it was time to knock George down. Deservedly so to some extent, because this is not a great album all the same. Um, the whole breakup of his marriage was a mess. Patty had run off with Eric Clapton, which is not entirely her fault because George hadn't exactly been a choir boy. George has even described this period of his life as sort of Peyton Place or a soap opera. He was hopping on Ringo's wife apparently, and then Patty was going out with Ronnie Wood, the guy that's in the Rolling Stones now, that was in the Faces then, and then George was jumping on Ronnie Wood's wife, and I don't know what the hell these people were doing out there, but anyway, just a big cluster mess up there, and so kind of a shame that he couldn't wait a year or so to do this album, because it might have been a lot better had he waited. His voice would have been improved, if nothing else. Maybe the songs aren't that great, so it still wouldn't have been that much of an improvement. But anyway, yeah, critics called this humorless, sanctimonious, preachy. Some of them had a few good things to say about it. Generally speaking, though, this knocked a lot of the goodwill out that George had built up with All Things and Material World in Bangladesh. And it'd be quite a while before he'd have another big hit again, unfortunately. So, anyway, let's get into the songs, I guess. Side 1, it opens with Harry's on Tour Express, which is an instrumental, one of the few instrumentals George did during his solo career, not counting Wonderwall or the Apple Jam disc, but I think the only other time he did one is on Brainwashed. But anyway, it's just this sort of 70s rock, soul, funk mix of a thing. It's got Tom Scott playing the saxophone. It gets a little cheesy, that 70s sax at times. It's too long, but it's a nice instrumental in the overall. I kind of enjoy it. Not a great song, but I like it. I'm going to give it a 7.5. This is what was written specifically for the tour that was coming up, and this is what they would open the shows with this instrumental, and then go into the singing parts. Second song on side 1 is called Simply Shady, which goes into the whole soap opera craziness that's going on in George's life at this time, falling off the wagon, and everybody's jumping into bed with everybody else that's not their wife or husband. It's kind of dour and depressing song, but I like it. I'm going to give it an 8. George's voice sounds like crap. Again, too bad he didn't wait till his voice got better to record the album and then do the tour. Probably would have worked out better. Downbeat song for sure, but it's a pretty good song. I'm giving it an 8. Third song is, and Simply Shady is the whole George and Patty breaking up stuff too again. There's a lot of this through this album. Third song on side 1 is called So Sad. This is George down in the dumps, dreary, and so it's a suitably downbeat and dreary song. And yet, I kind of like it, so I'm going to give it an 8. It's not the kind of song you'd want to listen to every day, but it's something that every once in a while you're in the mood for. Pretty good song, despite the sadness and depressing nature of it, I guess. So it gets an 8. Song number 4 is Bye Bye Love. The old Everly Brothers song is done by George, but he changes lyrics and he writes, includes some stuff about Eric and Patty Boyd. The liner notes say that Patty and Eric are on the song. I think they're really not. I think that was just sort of George's dark humor. In fact, I think he plays all the instruments himself on this song. This is probably the worst one on the album. It's just a wretched song. His voice is terrible. The song's terrible. The lyric changes are just uncomfortable and terrible. I give this song a 3. You'd think, and it's really strange, but I mean, it's nobody's business but George and the people involved. But here, him and Eric Clapton are friends, and they stay friends throughout George's life. And Eric Clapton's coming around, and here you got the Yardbirds' least interesting, the third best guitarist in the Yardbirds, coming around and sniffing around George's wife, and you would think that George would beat the hell out of him or something, but instead he just says, better she goes off with someone else than a loser like me or something. And then him and Eric stay friends throughout life. So strange stuff going on there, but whatever. Anyway, Bye Bye Love is a terrible song. It gets a 3. The side one ends with the song Maya Love, which is, I guess, the highlight of side one. Would be, I'm going to give that one a 9. It's sort of harkens back to living in the material world, sort of that fight, that duality between the spiritual and the material world, and illusions of this world and how that can trip you up. It's more referring to the breakup of Patty and George again. But it's a pretty song. It's kind of a blues funk and some nice slide guitar from George. Nice song, but pretty pleasant song, subject matter notwithstanding. I'm going to give that one a 9. So we go to side 2. Side 2 opens with Ding Dong Ding Dong, and finally some welcome, upbeat, kind of uplifting music here. This is George's, some people have called it his Christmas song. It's really a New Year's song because it doesn't have anything to do with Christmas per se. It's more of a ring in the new year type song. Probably about Olivia and Patty too. Ring in the new, ring out the old. He's met Olivia, and that's who he ends up marrying. Patty, ring out the old, I guess. Beatles too. The Beatles past, ring out the past, and I'm moving on to new things. Bit of a silly song, bit of a nursery rhyme, repetitive song, sort of a Monty Python-esque song in parts. The lyrics came from engravings at Friar Park, his house. The Sir Frank Crisp, who lived there way before George and Patty lived there, had engraved these sayings on the walls throughout the house. Sort of ties into George's lifelong spiritual journey somewhat, even though they're simplistic lyrics. But this was a single, got to number 38 in England, number 36 in the U.S. The problem, it was released in the U.S. like 2 or 3 days before Christmas, so really not in time to take advantage of holiday sales. New Year's song more than a Christmas song, but I mean you don't release a holiday song 2 days before Christmas and expect it to do much of anything. Critics didn't like this too much. Said it was, simplistic and plotting and silly. I think it's kind of catchy, funky. It is simplistic and plotting and silly, but it's fun, and it's a cute little holiday song, and it's upbeat, and it kind of a little bit of happiness on this album that has so much dourness otherwise. So I'm going to give Ding Dong a 9. I like it a lot. Second song on the side 2 is the title song called Dark Horse, or is it's often called Dark Horse, like the album is called. Probably my favorite song on the album. This was a single, got to number 15 in the U.S., didn't do anything in England. George always seemed the quiet Beatle, the Dark Horse Beatle, who, came up with something, and Here Comes the Sun on Abbey Road, who came out with arguably the best solo Beatles album ever, with All Things Must Pass. Maybe it's Ram and Plastic Ono Band you can throw in that mix, but the one that shined brightest, earliest after the Beatles broke up. So all of that stuff, and it's a catchy song. It's a great song. George's voice sounds terrible. It's a damn shame that he didn't record this, 6 months or a year later when his voice was in better shape, because it's a great song. It's one of the favorite of his solo songs. I'm going to give it a 10, even with the terrible voice. Next up, we got a song called Far East Man, which was co-written by George and Ron Wood. Same Ron Wood of the Rolling Stones, or wasn't in the Rolling Stones then, but a soulful ballad. both Ron Wood and George Harrison recorded a version of this song. Ron did it on his solo album. I've got my own album to do, which Ron Wood had been in the Faces around this time. And George plays on the Ron Wood version. I'm not sure if Ron Wood plays on the George version or not, but it's a good song. Like I said, sort of a soulful song, and kind of funny that they're writing songs together when they're sleeping with each other's wives. But I guess that was rock and roll in the 70s. So, um, good song. I give it a 9. Yes, I do. I give it a 9. The album ends with It Is He, which is a mixture of Indian music and sort of Western rock and pop, which of course George had done, kind of pioneered that with the Beatles, Norwegian Wood, and all those other songs, for instance. Um, it's kind of the solely overtly religious song on this album. It's also pretty catchy song, and I'm going to give it a 9. I like it. It's good end of the album. So, like I said, this is a sort of dreary, depressing, downbeat, dour album, and sort of a not a very good album, but it's not as bad as it's been labeled throughout the years. I don't think. I enjoy this. I've played it quite a bit in the last month or so, and it's one that I think I'm going to be pulling out to play here and there when I'm in the mood for it. This getting a party with friends together, you just isn't what you want to put on, that's for sure. But I think this album has merits. I wish George would have waited till his voice was in better shape to record it. And like I said, even then, this isn't All Things Must Pass. This isn't top-notch George solo work, but it is pretty okay, I think. I'm going to give it a 7. It probably really deserves like a 4 or a 5 if I was more realistic. So take my 7 with a grain of salt. The other thing is the flip side of Dark Horse 45 was a song called I Don't Care Anymore, which is a fun song. George starts off, he's kind of got a wheezy voice, says we got to do a B-side here, we've got a B-side to make. Sounds like an early Dylan, from like the Bob Dylan or the Freewheeling album, one of those. Just sort of a folk rock, upbeat, happy, fun, rollicking song. Really should have been on the album, which could have used little bit of relief and lightness with all the marriages breaking up and everything's falling apart on the album. I Don't Care Anymore. I'm going to give that one a 10. So yeah, like I said, I don't really know that my review is of any help to anyone, because this is not a great album, but it's an album that I like quite a bit. And well, I admit that it's nowhere near George's best. So things will get better, but I think they're going to get worse before they get better. Anyway, that's George Harrison's Dark Horse album, and have a good Sunday, everybody. We'll see you later.